Hi, welcome to the Daily. My name is Brendan Malone. Today I want to talk about the issue of assisted suicide, which is back in the news again because we have a New Zealand Government Select Committee, the Health Select Committee, which currently has an inquiry underway. They're taking submissions from the public about end-of-life issues, and one particular aspect that they're looking at is this whole idea of assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is where, upon request, a doctor would kill their patient by administering a lethal injection, as I said, if the patient requests that. Let's be clear about, first of all, what we're talking about here. We're not talking about turning off life support once it has become a burden to the patient. We're not talking about do not resuscitate orders. We're not talking about patients being given appropriate care. We're not talking about patients being forced to carry on living, even though they'll be forced to undergo burdensome or extraordinary treatments. The current law in New Zealand already allows a person to die naturally, for nature to take its course. The law does not force them to live on and on. It doesn't force them to receive treatments that they don't want to receive. The law actually is a very good law in this country, and it also requires doctors to give proper care and support to people in the final stages of their life, what we call palliative or end-of-life care, to help people pass in those final stages if they are suffering from some sort of serious illness or perhaps a disability or something else that's going to have a bearing on their final passing. What we're talking about here, as I said, is this idea that we change New Zealand law to allow doctors to administer lethal injections to their patients upon request. Now, I don't know about you, but as far as I'm concerned, that's a really dumb idea. It's a very bad proposed law change. Now, I'm not really interested in the morality of this issue. For me, this is not about how you feel about the morality of suicide or someone who's ill taking their own life. I'm instead interested in looking at and responding to the practical effects of what will happen if you change New Zealand law to allow and enshrine in legislation this idea that it can be good for doctors to deliberately end the life of their patient with lethal injections. That's what I'm talking about, and I think that's what we need to focus on. As I said, it's not about the morality, it's about the practical effects. And we can look to the overseas experience and we can see why this would be a very bad idea to implement a law like this in New Zealand. It really isn't rocket science once you go digging, and you don't have to dig very far at all to see the research that's been produced, the surveys that have been done, the data that's been collected, and everywhere in those tiny minority of jurisdictions that have gone down this path and legalised euthanasia, you can see the very serious negative impacts that this has had on the vulnerable members of the community. Because it's one thing to be someone who is wealthy, who's well off, who's a bit scared of death or illness and doesn't know what's coming, and so you want to end it all quickly and you want to just, quit and have a doctor give you a lethal injection. That's one thing. You probably have the capital, the ability to navigate the healthcare system, and in a hypothetical world where you're discussing this hypothetical law, then, as I said, in a perfect hypothetical world, you could possibly make this law work. But we don't live and operate in a perfect hypothetical world. We operate in a very imperfect world that is governed ultimately by human nature, particularly in this situation. Regardless of how good you think your laws are, regardless of how good you think your doctors and nurses are, there is still this thing called human nature which has a bearing on any sort of system or the governance or oversight of any and the execution, excuse the pun, of any sort of system like this that we're talking about. And I think it's either extremely dishonest or extremely naive for people to suggest that there will not be wrongful deaths of vulnerable people if we go down the path of legalising assisted suicide in this country. I say that because A, it's already happened overseas. We can look to those jurisdictions that have already gone down this path and we can see that is exactly what is happening. Vulnerable people are being wrongly killed every year in those jurisdictions, or they are being killed under very questionable circumstances. So in other words, they haven't made an explicit request and yet they are still being given lethal injections. And we can see the impact that this is having, and that's precisely why Professor Theo Boer, who is from the Netherlands, he is someone who has no moral problem with the idea of assisted suicide. He was supportive of the original law change, and now, having lived under that system, having worked under that system, and having seen it in action and seen the way that things have now got out of hand, he now speaks out against legalising assisted suicide. A couple of years ago, he appeared before the House of Lords in the UK when they were debating this issue, and he literally said to them, whatever you do, Do not do what we have done. It was a huge mistake. Don't go down this path. It's been a disaster, and it has created all sorts of very serious problems. And it's kind of obvious why that would happen when you stop and think about it, because the whole foundation of medical ethics that we operate under in this country is built on this very important idea that doctors are not meant to do any deliberate harm to their patients. That good medicine is about treating a patient, caring for a patient, assisting a patient. But assisted suicide completely turns that on its head. And what assisted suicide says is that in actual fact, if a patient requests it, it can be a good thing for a doctor to deliberately kill their patient, so do the ultimate harm by way of lethal injection, as long as the patient requests it. That completely flips our medical ethics, our code of conduct, everything gets flipped on its head if you embrace that idea and enshrine that idea in law and bring it into medical practice. Look, we've got a pretty good healthcare system in this country, but it's not perfect because human nature is human nature, and human beings obviously ultimately govern and carry out the work of our healthcare sector. That's why there have been people who have died in this country because of mistaken diagnosis or not getting the proper treatment that they need, or for all sorts of other reasons where human nature has an effect on the way people receive or the way health information or health care is given to people. Like I said, I think it's extremely naive or extremely dishonest to claim then that in a system like ours, which already has flaws and where people are wrongly and negatively impacted by those flaws, it's extremely naive and extremely dishonest to suggest that you could introduce a law which would allow doctors to kill their patient with lethal injection, and that we would not see, as an end result of that, vulnerable people ending up being wrongly killed. Look, we already have things in this country like a very serious epidemic of elder abuse. How do we think that's going to work out if we change New Zealand law and make it legal now to kill people with lethal injections upon request? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that there are going to be vulnerable elderly people who begin to request those lethal injections because they are coerced into it by family members, perhaps family members who are tired of caring for that person or who don't have the necessary skills to care for that person, so they don't want the situation to carry on. Perhaps family members who want an inheritance and don't want to see it frittered away on healthcare costs. Perhaps vulnerable, lonely elderly people who begin to feel that they are a burden wrongly on their family. And so they make this decision because they feel that they are now in an imposition, and so they rush themselves towards a suicidal death. It is naive, as I said, to think that this won't happen in this country. The other thing that is very serious about any law change like this is that we would now have a situation in which, in our country, we'd be saying to one group of people, hey, you shouldn't commit suicide because that's not a good thing. There is always hope, no matter how much you feel that your life is meaningless, or no matter how dark the suffering that you are going through, no matter how difficult the reality is that you are facing, there is always hope. You don't need to give in to fear. You don't need to give in to that despair. You don't need to allow that darkness to overwhelm you. We will be with you. We will care for you. We will help you to walk through this very dark and shadowy valley. So on the one hand, you'd have anti-suicide campaigns promoting messages like that. On the other hand, you would have enshrined in law and happening in our hospitals and being carried out by doctors every single day in this country, this idea that a person committing suicide is actually a good thing. If they believe that their life no longer has value, if they believe that they no longer have any sort of quality of life, there's no purpose to carrying on, they don't think that there is going to be any more value in any further time here on this earth. It is absurd to think those two ideas could coexist together. They simply can't. They really can't. I can't see any way that you can marry those two things up. The moment you glamorize suicide, which is what people are doing here, by saying that taking your own life or having a doctor give you a lethal injection and assisting in your suicide is actually a good thing, it's a heroic thing, it's a dignified thing to do, is the moment you completely undermine any sort of chance of trying to turn around and combat suicide in your society. Now people try and make distinctions and say, oh, but those people are usually healthy and they're not sick, But all you're arguing about there is a difference by degree. It's not a substantial or major difference. So if someone says to you, well, look, my life, I'm terminal and my life is going to end in maybe weeks or months, what's the point in carrying on? Because I don't see any value in any further time here on this earth. There's really no difference. The only difference is the amount of time that person will spend on earth between someone else who's maybe a bit younger and healthier and who doesn't have those issues and who says, I don't see any point in carrying on. I don't think my life has quality, and I don't see any point in carrying on this earth for another moment longer. To me, it's an undignified life that I'm living. There really is no substantial difference there. The difference is only one of degree, and it's a matter of how many weeks or days or months or years they have left to them on this earth. Now, of course, at this point, people who object to the position that I have adopted would normally say, but don't worry, we can put legal safeguards in place, and those legal safeguards will protect the wrongful killing of vulnerable people. Two things. Number one, that has not worked overseas. In the minority of jurisdictions where they have already legalised euthanasia, those supposed legal safeguards, they are simply not working. Every year in those jurisdictions, there are people who are being killed wrongfully or under very dubious circumstances, which is precisely why, as I said, Dr. Theo Boer has spoken out against what they have in the Netherlands and said, don't legalise it. It's a bad idea. Bad things happen when you go down this path. So it hasn't worked overseas. And number two, and this is really, really important, we can look to a completely different scenario which involves the killing of a person, which has all sorts of serious and pretty impressive legal safeguards in place. And we can see that even in that situation, those legal safeguards still fail. And that system, of course, is the legalised death penalty in the United States. Now, before you can even be charged with a crime that carries the death penalty, there is a fairly high evidentiary standard that has to be met by the police. So before they can charge you, they have to meet a high evidentiary standard, and they have to make sure that they've collected that evidence in a way that hasn't violated your natural justice rights. And then you can be charged. At that point, once you're charged, you then go before a court and you have a lengthy trial. And you have someone who represents you and advocates for you and makes the case that you have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And all sorts of experts are called. The trial happens before a judge who adjudicates things. There is a jury involved and you get to make your case. And the trial takes as long as is needed to present all of the evidence and all of the facts. Not only that, it's a very public process. Obviously members of the public are often allowed to sit in on these trials, or there is a media presence of some kind that reports on or directly broadcasts these trials. Then on top of that, even if you are found guilty and this is a mistake, you still have a series of appeals that are open to you so you can appeal the decision. On top of that, even if those appeals fail you, there is the last resort of clemency, an appeal of clemency to the governor. Now, despite all of those legal safeguards, and they are stringent, they really are huge legal safeguards that are in place there, despite all of that, innocent, vulnerable people still end up being wrongly killed by that system. So if it can happen in that system, which has a massive legal safeguards in place, we are either dishonest or naive, as I said, to claim that vulnerable people will not be wrongly killed when you're talking about a system of legalised euthanasia, where there is no public involvement in the decision, where it's simply a matter of a couple of doctors having a discussion after the patient has requested it and signing a piece of paper. If you are like me and you think this is a really bad idea and that vulnerable people in our community deserve better than an assisted suicide law being passed into law in this country, then you need to make a submission to the Health Select Committee and voice your concerns. I'm going to put a link in the video description for today's episode, and that link will take you to a website where you can actually make a submission and give you some ideas about what you can say. It's pretty simple stuff. You just have to, it doesn't have to be a novel, it doesn't have to be long. You just state your case, give the reasons why you think this is not a good idea, and then you obviously sign your name. I'll put a link, as I said, to a website which will give you more details about how to do that and how to make an online submission. And I will also include the email address of the Health Select Committee. You can email them directly, so you can write your submission and then email it to them. It's very simple. You've got till next Monday, Monday the 1st of February. If it's sent in the post, apparently as long as it's post-dated the 1st of February, submissions will still be accepted. So as I said, if you care about this and you care about vulnerable people in our community and what happens to them, then you need to get active and be a voice on this issue. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily.